Good morning. My name is Nick Talley. I'm a gastroenterologist and I also edit the Medical Journal of Australia. Before I was the editor of the MJA, I was the editor of Alimentary Pharmacology and Therapeutics, and before that the American Journal of Gastroenterology. And I've published some papers as well, and I do research. So I have a reasonable understanding of research, but I'm hoping to make this a little bit of an interactive symposium rather than a lecture. I also have a long time to speak, and you will become very, very bored with me if I stand here and talk all the time. So I'm hoping you'll help me by interacting. So let me ask you the first question. Who's published in a journal, anywhere in the world? Who's published a paper in a journal anywhere? Hands up, great. Thank you. Who has never published in a journal anywhere? Who has never published in a journal? Don't worry, there's no prizes and there's no wrong answers. Okay, good. Who wants to publish in an international journal? Who wants to publish in it? Everybody wants to publish. All right. So that's a very clear answer to my very short survey. So I've divided this presentation into two parts. Part one is about medical journals because they are changing. They are evolving. And there are some very, very good journals, and there are some journals you should never, ever, ever publish in. Seriously, ever. Ever. And so it's very important you understand the landscape of journals. So I'll take you through that landscape so you have some understanding. Then I'll talk about my suggestions about how to get your research published, how to get through the peer review system. I'll also talk about peer review, what's good about it and what's bad about it. And finally, I'll tell you, at least I'll try to tell you, that research is really exciting. If you believe in your results, you should try very hard and persist to get this published, because sometimes it's a very long road. Sometimes the editors are wrong. Sometimes the peer reviewers are wrong. Sometimes the experts are wrong. I absolutely guarantee it. And one more fact, half of what you teach your medical students, half, is absolutely incorrect. I just don't know which half. Anatomy's a slightly different example. Anatomy's good. That's usually pretty straightforward. Most of that's right. But when you get to the rest of it, a lot of the facts we believe in are wrong. That's why we do research, to get it right. Knowledge is evolving. Knowledge is not absolute. The textbooks, and I write textbooks, the textbooks are often wrong, just like the experts. Yep. So you still have to learn the facts, but recognise they're often wrong. That's why we do research. So I hope those things are helpful. All right. Now, I couldn't help but put a picture of the President of the United States up because, you know, it's a good example of this disruptive change that we're living in the 21st century. And there's disruption in politics. There's disruption in scientific beliefs, and there's disruption in medical journals too. So we're living in an age of big change. Some people argue this age, this revolution, we're living in a revolution, and we don't know where it's going to end up. It's very interesting in terms of world politics and world science. For example, I'm very concerned that people just don't believe scientists anymore. There's lots of disbelief, but it's based on illogical and preconceived ideas rather than scientific scrutiny and debate. So it's very good in science to question, but it's very bad in science to believe without to not believe data that continues to confirm beliefs. And I mean, a good example is relativity, Einstein's theory of relativity. It's been tested and tested and tested and tested over 100 years of different tests, and it stands up. It's probably true, at least most of it. Okay? To say I don't believe it because I don't want to believe it is crazy. That's the anti-science movement, and there's a lot of it in the world. So it's very interesting times in politics, in science, and in medicine. And in medicine. There are many out there in my country who don't believe, for example, vaccinations work. They just don't believe it. They choose not to believe it. Now, they can choose to do whatever they like, but that's not science. Science is about evidence, more evidence, more evidence, and then we start to believe the story that is unfolding. We don't believe one study. It takes more than one study to change the world. Your first study will not change the world. But if you do repeated studies that confirm a new hypothesis, that can change the world. So you can change the world, all of you, with your science. You can. You just need a good hypothesis, and then you need to collect the data to confirm it. Now, I've had many, many, many good hypotheses, most of them wrong. Seriously. Some of them right, most of them wrong. That's science, okay? You don't get it right every time. Nobody does. Nobody does. So that's important. Now, I'm trying to predict the future when I talk about the future of medical journals. And I want to preface this by saying everyone who tries to predict the future is almost always wrong, okay? Guaranteed. Guaranteed. And there's some wonderful quotes here from some very famous people about why it's so difficult, predicting the future. But I'm going to try anyway, because I'm trying to predict the future of medical journals and how we will present medical science in the future. It is quite possible all of the current major medical journals will disappear. Seriously. In the internet age, that is possible. So I'm going to try and predict the future, but I'm probably wrong. I don't quite know what will happen. There will be things that I won't expect to happen, but there is change going to happen. That's the one thing I am convinced about. There's change going to happen. The question is what? And I'll talk about what I'll explain this as I go forward. Now, if anybody wants to ask me a question at any time, please put your hand up and ask me. There is no such thing as a bad question. There is no such thing. The only bad thing is if you don't ever ask questions. Okay? That's bad. That means you're not thinking, you're sleeping. Please. Look, this is wonderful. What a wonderful audience. I get a question. Fantastic. Please.
So you just focus on what you're interested in. So you don't care about the current current trend. So I wonder you don't predict about the future. So you just focus on the work you're interested in, right?
Yes, absolutely right. It's a very good question. So when you're learning research, at least in my view, You need to find an area you are interested in, something you want to study. And that's very, very important. If you don't like the area, you won't be passionate, you won't put the effort in that's needed to progress. I'll tell you a bit more. Go on, please.
So when I am a beginner in studying how to do research, I want to be maybe I want to predict the future. I want to be the first. Yes.
Of course.
Yes. So I really want to the explorer of the new explorer. So so predict the future. I think this is the key. Yes.
It is.
So I'm so surprised about this slide. Yes.
So all I can tell you is the journey in research is a personal journey. It's different to studying textbooks in medical school, for example, where you're given the material to learn and you learn it. That is not research. Research is learning two things. Is having ideas and then knowing how to collect the information to answer your questions, to explore the ideas. It's two different things. And as I'm taking this apart, good. So two things to say. When I was a medical student, I really wanted to do research, and I had absolutely no idea how to do it. Not any at all, zero. And I even spoke to some of my senior professors. They didn't seem to have much of an idea either, some of them anyway. Or at least they couldn't help me do research in the way that I wanted to. But then I was very lucky. I did find somebody, a mentor, a professor, who I could train with. And that person trained me in the research methodology and also helped me formulate ideas. So in addition to wanting to do it and being passionate about it, I think you need to have a mentor who knows how to do research and can help lead you. The best mentors give you the freedom to think and work yourself under guidance. Even my PhD students, I may give them a project, and at the end of the 3 years, they may have a completely different project to the one I gave them. Maybe completely different. Absolutely looks nothing like I started with. But that's research. Research is about following the ideas, not following some protocol that may not go anywhere. Final point is many experiments fail. PhD students, many of them complain in their first year in particular, my research is failing. All my experiments blew up, or whatever. Okay, they didn't work. And that's part of research too, because sometimes that's what happens and you need to be prepared for those setbacks. Sometimes that can still lead, in fact it usually does, to different experiments that can then be beneficial. So anyway, I hope I've tried to sort of answer your question a little bit. But thank you for asking a question. And please, I encourage questions. I really want questions. All right, so what are medical journals? Medical journals evolved. So this was the first medical journal, the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, 1665, first journal. And what did they do? They put in papers from thought leaders, from professors, into a publication. They just collected publications. And then over time, they invented the idea that other experts should review the work submitted before it gets published. Other experts should look at the work and decide, is it worthy of publication? That is the idea of peer review. That is still the idea of peer review. Peer reviewers get it wrong. And the more original your idea, the higher the risk they will reject you. Think about this. The more original, the better your study, the more likely it is they will reject it. Here's the classic example. They rejected Edward Jenner's report of vaccination against smallpox. Now, seriously, this was a revolutionary idea. Revolutionary. And the peer reviewers just didn't believe it. Didn't want to believe it. I have another example in my field. I know Professor Barry Marshall very well. Anyone heard of Professor Barry Marshall? The discoverer of Helicobacter pylori, the discoverer of the cause of peptic ulcers and gastric cancer. Professor Barry Marshall and Professor Robin Warren. I know Barry very well. He's a good friend of mine. Barry's discovery, Barry and Robin's discovery, nobody wanted to believe it. I remember their first presentation and the questions that were asked from the audience. I remember that they had trouble publishing some of their initial data. And this was because it was a revolutionary idea. The idea that bacteria in the stomach, which the textbooks said was sterile, that's what the textbooks said because of gastric acid. Stomach is sterile, that's the textbooks. These guys come up with this crazy idea. There are bacteria in the stomach and oh my goodness, they cause gastritis, inflammation, and they cause cancer. And they cause ulcers. That's insane. Except it was absolutely not. Now those guys won the Nobel Prize in the end. It took 10 years before many would accept those initial observations. 10 years. And 15 to get the Nobel Prize, which was pretty quick actually. Most people wait 30 or 40, so that was actually remarkably quick. Anyway, I've got stories about that too, but I won't tell you. I know who reviewed the Nobel laureate applications, and anyway, it's good fun, but not relevant. All right, so this is where I like to publish, where I want to publish. I'm a clinician. I see patients, okay? I do some basic science now, although when I started, my work was clinical research more than basic research. So if you're a basic scientist, you want to publish in Nature or Science or Cell. And if you're a clinician researcher, you want to publish in the New England Journal or JAMA or Annals or BMJ, etc. Yeah. And as I've said to you, it's very interesting. These journals, these great journals, are at high risk of disappearing. Yeah. Very interesting. Which is very sad actually, but I will explain it. So some people are looking very perplexed. What am I talking about? These are the great journals, and they have, you know, the New England Journal has a circulation of 1.5 million people. That's a lot of people. That's the circulation. That's enormous. But it's online. Anyway, we'll come to it. Now, I've already said this, but I'll emphasize it. Many people, at least in the places I've worked, will do research, will perhaps even write an abstract for a scientific meeting, may present the work at the scientific meeting, a poster, or even an oral presentation, and then never publish the paper. This is common. And I tell my students, if you do not publish the paper in a peer-reviewed journal, the work doesn't exist. It does not exist. Nobody can find it, or it's hard to find at best. Nobody will cite it, or rarely they will cite an abstract. It's uncommon. It can happen, but it's uncommon. So what I'm really saying is the reason journals exist is to validate the research. Goes through peer review, an editorial review, the article is published, and then people tend to believe it. They shouldn't, but they tend to. But that's the process. So I tell my students, yes, it's important to do the research and do it well. Yes, it's important to present the research to your peers at scientific meetings. That's very, very important. But in the end, it's most important that you publish it in a respectable journal. And the word respectable is a bit vague, but I'll come to it. So you need to publish your work, and everybody who wants to publish their work, everyone who's a PhD student, everybody who is an academic will need to publish their work, as they should. I believe every doctor in training should learn research methodology and publish something. I believe that. In my university, that is now the rule, as it is in other universities across Australia, some of them anyway. So, the dinosaurs were here a long time. I think it was 165 million years. And then one day they were no longer here. They disappeared. They were gone in the blink of an eye. And medical journals might have the same fate, including mine, which I'm very proud of. The MJA is a very good journal. I'll talk about that because you should know. It's actually doing extremely well and going up in the rankings. But regardless, even my journal's at risk, and I'm the editor. So what am I talking about? Well, there's a tsunami coming. A tsunami coming. It's already arrived. It's already rolled the cars over. And it's the tsunami of the internet age. The age of open access. The age of anybody can be a publisher. You can be a publisher. What do you have to do? You have to have a computer. Whoa. You have to have internet connection. Oh my goodness. That's it. You are a publisher. You can publish online. You can be an editor. I'm an editor, you could say, today. I'm an editor. I've decided I'm good enough. I'm going to accept papers. I'm going to publish them online. I'm an open access publisher. I'll charge the people who want to publish with me, which will pay my bills. And I hopefully will peer review if I feel like it. Maybe. Maybe. Yeah. I think you're starting to see the problem. So, I mentioned the MJA and I put it in here, so I'll talk about it briefly. So what is the MJA? So we're over 100 years old, which isn't bad. We've been going a long time. We published one of the papers that led to Barry Marshall's Nobel Prize. Not bad. And we've published other papers that have been landmarks. Some of them are listed on the slide. Q fever, antibiotics for peptic ulcer. Yeah, antibiotics for peptic ulcer, which we know work very well. Folate deficiency and neural tube defects for those who are interested in those areas. Terribly important. Rubella and fetal damage. And the fact that going to hospital can kill you. In fact, it often does. Healthcare can harm as well as help. Yeah, good stuff. We're high impact, our impact factor, I'll talk about what the impact factor is, you need to understand that, is good and going up, and we're trusted. And we have a circulation of, well, I wish we had 1.5 million. We have a 30,000 circulation in print and a much bigger online presence, about 200,000 downloads a month. So lots of people look at us. So it's a good journal. But we're at risk too, just like the others, like the New England Journal, JAMA, Annals, British Medical Journal. So what am I talking about? Why am I saying there's a tsunami? This is the concept. It's a business concept. It's a wonderful concept of disruptive innovation. Think about it. Think about the taxi industry in my country. Okay? Uber comes along and says, we'll undercut all the taxi drivers. We're just going to come in out of the blue, and the taxi drivers are irrelevant. We don't care what they do. Their licenses, the value of which was in Australian dollars about $180,000, dropped to zero. They're worthless. Nobody wants a taxi license. What for? It costs a bomb, and I could be an Uber driver for a lot less. And by the way, everyone likes Uber because you just put on your phone, you just call them up, they turn up, take you away. That's disruptive innovation. True disrupt. The industry you disrupt is destroyed. Not overnight, over time. So there are still taxis. They're just looking a bit at risk. Yeah. What about the iPhone? Oh my goodness, the iPhone has totally changed the world in lots of ways. True disruptive innovation. Think about it. The world before iPhones. I was alive then. I was alive. No iPhones. None. Nothing like it. It was a much better world, by the way, in some ways. In other ways, no. And there's a very famous Harvard professor, I've studied under this guy, called Clay Christensen. He's the Harvard business professor. There's a wonderful program at Harvard on medical education and business that they run. I went to that program. It was fantastic. I'd recommend it for academics interested in such things. And what he said was this. This is his model, but it applies first to the steel industry, and then we'll talk about other things. So what he said was this. In the 70s, steel mills ran steel industry. Steel mills were it. There was nothing else, okay? They were expensive, lots of equipment, produced very high quality steel. Very high quality. Good for buildings, good for other things. Then some low-cost operators came in who made inferior steel, much less quality, but much cheaper. Much cheaper. And the standard steel industries could not compete. So they gave away their low quality end of the business. The people who only wanted low quality steel, they just gave it away to the new operator. So these people took over that part of the business. Except these people continued to develop their technology, and then they got better at doing low cost steel, and they produced better steel. Well, still wasn't as good as the other guys. It was inferior. Inferior, but cheaper, but better. So they took that end of the business away too. And then after a while, these guys started to go broke because they couldn't make a profit. And their shareholders got upset and sold their shares, etc., etc. And these guys got better at the technology. So in the end, the new player took over the entire business, and all the steel mills went bankrupt. All of them. Bankrupt. Gone. Finished. Kaput. That's disruptive innovation. And what's it all about? It's about what you need. Every business, including journals, is there because there's a need and there's a business model. And what's the need for journals? I need to get my research published as fast as possible with perfect certainty. Except I don't need a medical journal to do it. I just don't. I just don't need one. I just need somebody who's an editor who has passed muster, is considered respectable for my research. I just need someone who'll publish my research that's respectable. That's all I need. I don't need to go to a traditional medical journal. Now remember, to run the Medical Journal of Australia and the New England Journal and JAMA and the Lancet and the BMJ, and by the way, I know all the editors of all those journals, They all have infrastructure costs. I have staff who are my deputy medical editors, who I pay. I have structural editors who edit your manuscript to make it read well, to ensure that the tables are correct, to get the figures right, to redraw the figures if necessary, to bring in illustrations. I have to pay those people. I have to run a peer review process, very robust. I meet twice a week with all my editors, face to face, to talk about the journal articles submitted, to review them, to review the peer review reports. So that all costs money. Everybody's got some sort of support, salary, etc. to do this. And then we print the journal. We don't just do it online, we print it, which means it costs money. That costs money to run. Now think about it. If you're a low-cost operator, doesn't matter if you're inferior, if you're a low-cost operator, you can come in and take all that away. You don't pay anybody salaries, or you don't pay many people. You don't print it, because people don't read print that much anymore. Less people do. So, who likes to read their articles in print? Printed. Who likes to read your articles printed? Who likes to read online? Nobody wants to read print. There you go. Not a single person put their hand up in the room that I could see for print. Not anybody. Think about it. That's disruptive innovation. You've all got used to, or perhaps you never changed, some of you are very young, all have got used to the idea you don't need to print. And yet all of the high quality journals still print at the moment, at least some copies. Okay, so we have the MJA founded in 1914. We have the Science Citation Index. This is the list of all the journals and their rankings. I'll come back to what a ranking of a journal means. In 1989, the first online journal was published. 89. It's actually quite a long time ago when you think about it. And that was the beginning of disruptive innovation. And in 2003, the journal PLOS was first published. I'll come to PLOS. Big success, sort of. Big success. And a very reputable journal group, by the way. That's a reputable, high-quality journal group. Yeah. Okay. So what's disrupting us? It's the principle, and I believe in this principle, that all research, all reputable research, needs to be freely available to read and share. That's the principle. Think about it. Think about it. Freely available. That means you can download the entire article for no cost, essentially, and read it and use it. No matter where it's published, no matter who you are, even if you're not a scientist. The only question is, who pays? Because nothing in the world is free. Nothing I know of is free. Who pays? That's the question. And the disruption is changing of payors. So right now, if you're a researcher and you send your article to the New England Journal, and if it's accepted for publication, which is wonderful, you don't have to pay. You pay nothing. You pay nothing. But the article is behind a paywall. Once it's published, for at least a year or two, sometimes for good, depends on the journal. So in other words, the payor is the subscriber to the journal, not you as the researcher. That's who pays, essentially. The subscribers pay. So when you subscribe, you are paying for those articles to be published. In the open access journal world, you pay as the researcher. And you pay a reasonable amount. Even I find it painful to pay $5,000 out of my research grant. $5,000 for an article to be published in an open access journal. I don't like that at all. I find that objectionable, but that's just perhaps because I'd rather spend the $5,000 on my research, on doing more research, not paying the journal. But that's just me. Of course, in the MJA, you do not pay. I mean, the subscribers pay, just like, and the advertisers. By the way, there are advertisers. That's the other piece of the business model. So there's subscribers who subscribe to the journal and pay a fee, and then there are advertisers who pay the journal to put their ads in. But advertising is doing what? What do you think advertising in medical journals is doing? Is it going up? Is it going down? Is it steady? Any ideas? What is happening to advertising in medical journals? Any idea? It's going down and down and down. Think about it. 1/3 of the 1/3 of the business model, approximately 1/3, is relying on advertising. 1/3. Just imagine if there's no 1/3. That means you are starting to feel economic pressure. It's called disruptive innovation. It's exactly what's happening. Yeah. There's also something called a predatory journal. Anybody heard the term predatory journal? Hands up. Anybody heard the term? Fantastic. What do you think it means? Can I ask? I mean, I don't mind if you don't know or don't get it right, but I'm sure you do. What do you think it means? Predatory journal.
So I think it's firstly it's free, and so that it gives the opportunity for researchers they would like to publish their article or research, and that's the one of the tool to get the communication between the researcher and the summary maybe in the science in the worldwide. That's just my thinking.
So I just like to contribute a little more. It's free, but the process of the peer review is really bad. And I think in the majority, so they just would like to get the money from the researchers.
So well said, both of you. So that's right. So a predatory journal is the model I talked about earlier. I want to be an editor. There we go. I'm going to be an editor. I'm going to open my journal. I'm going to call it the Journal of the Asian Pacific Medical Research, whatever, okay, or whatever my journal name is. Sometimes the name looks remarkably similar to a major journal. And then I will accept articles. Please send me your article. I will send emails to all the world experts and ask for them to send me an article. I get an email every 15 minutes from a predatory journal. Not quite, but close. I get an amazing number of these. Please send me an article because I need to fill my issue. I don't even answer them. And then you send your article in, 5 minutes later it's accepted. Thank you, great article, fantastic, we'll publish it. No peer review. Or perhaps poor peer review. Or perhaps poor editorial and poor peer review. Who knows? It depends. These are the predatory journals. And I'll talk more about those in a minute. There's the open science movement. Anybody heard of open science in Europe? This is a big deal. This year, the funders of European science and UK science, this is medical science as well, the funders have said, if we fund you, you must publish in an open access journal. Now, what they mean is gold open access. That means the entire journal is freely open. You can't have part of the journal open and it be called a journal they'll accept. Now, you might say that sounds all right, But that rules out Nature, Science, Cell, New England Journal, JAMA, Lancet, BMJ, all of those, all ruled out. They're all no, that they do not fulfill the criteria. So think about it. This is a revolution. Yeah. Now you might agree with it in principle. Perhaps it's the right solution long term. But in the short term, it's disruptive innovation. Very disruptive. What have the journals said? We don't care. We publish the best research. If you're stupid enough to send it somewhere else, that's your problem. Because we're the best. And I can tell you, as a researcher, I object no end to the funder telling me where I can publish my work. I find that abhorrent. What in heaven's name? I didn't compete for the funding from you for you to tell me where to send my work. I find that abhorrent. I consider that inappropriate. I've told them so. I've told them so. All right. And then, remember I said journal articles are behind a paywall. Well, if you don't like the paywall, you don't want to pay, just go here. Sci-Hub. So this is fascinating. So this is an engineer. She's really smart. She's a computer engineer. She's not a scientist per se. She's a computer engineer, and she's basically set up software to bypass the paywalls of the publishers. It's illegal, but nobody can do anything about it in Kazakhstan. Nobody can do anything about it in Kazakhstan. No. So she's done it. So you can go here and just get any article you want for free. Now, I'm not telling you to do this because this is illegal, but that doesn't mean you won't do it. There's millions of people doing it. But it's not legal, per se. However, it's disruptive innovation. It just shows you the old business model is dead. There's no way the current medical journal business model will survive 50 years. No way. It may not survive 10. So how about that? She's very interesting. Look her up. Of course, please. Is that the website? No, actually. But if you go on Wikipedia, you'll find the website. So I just use Wikipedia source, and the photographs from Wiki as well. And by the way, Wikipedia is a disruptive innovation. Who goes to Wikipedia to look something up first when you've got a question about some general area that you'd like to start exploring? Who goes to Wikipedia first? I do. Yeah, some people put their hands up. I do. And it's usually pretty good. And by the way, Wikipedia is peer-reviewed. Well, at least there are people who look at this over time, so it sort of evolves. That's a disruptive innovation in science too. In fact, some people think Wikipedia will be the future of journals. My goodness, interesting. So let's talk about PLOS. So remember I talked about this was a revolution when PLOS came out, because PLOS basically challenged nature. And this is what they wrote. They wrote that really we need a change in the professional way we do this, and we're the change that's coming. PLOS is the change that's coming. So how much does it cost to publish in PLOS? Well, it's about $1,595 US. 1,500, nearly 1,600 US. That's a lot of money. Even I feel that. I said 5,000 before. I've had journals ask for $5,000. Doesn't make me happy. Now, the model is different. Think about it. If you send an article to the Medical Journal of Australia or the New England Journal, if you send it to us, we peer review it if we think it's good enough. So we editorially review, then we peer review, then we re-editorial review, then there may be a revision, then we re-peer review, then we re-editorial review, then we do it again until we've got it right, unless we reject you. We reject 90% of original research we receive. 90. Yeah, we do. Close to it. The New England Journal rejects 97%. Yeah. Top journals, 10% acceptance rate, it's about right. This is for original research. This isn't for reviews and other things. This is original research I'm talking about. Yeah. So where does that all go? It goes to the next tier journal. So what happens is if it's rejected, the authors typically, unless it's fatally flawed, sometimes even if it is fatally flawed, sadly, they will send it to another journal until eventually it gets published. So there's a ranking of journals from the very, very best, or at least what people think are the very best, to lesser. Not bad, they're not bad journals, just lesser rankings. They're not bad. Don't get disheartened. We all publish in journals of different rankings. There's no doubt about that. So it's not a matter of it's a bad journal because it's down here. That's not true. It's just a different journal with different requirements. Yeah, not as competitive. Okay. PLOS has a different model though, because journals like to publish work that is interesting or changes practice or changes policy or changes science. PLOS has a different philosophy. PLOS's philosophy is, if it's methodologically sound, we will publish it. Doesn't matter if it's interesting or not. Doesn't matter if it changes practice or not. Doesn't matter if it's important or not. It's methodologically sound, we will publish it. Now that's a real plus, particularly for early career researchers trying to get their first paper in an international journal. So they accept 70%. The problem is you have to pay for it. Seriously. So it's a very interesting model. But who is going to read all this? Think about it. Think about all these papers, millions of them, millions. Who's going to read them all? Well, I look at the New England Journal and JAMA and Lance. I look at what's coming out in those journals because sometimes I want to learn what's happening and perhaps change my perspective, my knowledge. I'm never going to read PLOS One. I'm going to find it online only if it's relevant to the research I'm doing directly. So it's a completely different philosophy. It's not I'm going to read this journal, it's I'm only going to look at the article if it's relevant to me for whatever reason. And there's lots of stuff in there nobody ever reads, nobody ever cites. So remember, as a scientist, as a researcher, you have three things you want. You want someone to read your paper besides you. Someone else. Someone to cite your paper. That means they thought it was important. If they cite you, if they quote your paper, that means what you wrote is important in some way or another. Maybe, whatever reason it is, it's still important. It doesn't matter if they don't even like your paper. The point is you want to be cited. And thirdly, as a researcher, I want to change the world. Okay? I do. That's very hard. That's what I want. And so I'm hoping in the long run that's what will happen. Yeah, that's what you're trying to do. So PLOS has some real advantages. And it's a very good journal, by the way. And there's PLOS Medicine, PLOS One. Now, PLOS One, and I'll talk about impact factor, has a very good impact factor. Publishes lots of articles, 30,000 in 2013. 1 in 60 of all medical articles in PubMed were published in PLOS One a few years ago. Think about it. That's enormous. Enormous. So enormous impact. Its ranking, however, has been falling. And it's been falling because people don't cite it. If you don't cite a journal, you don't get a high ranking. So rankings are all about how my work is recognised, how my work is cited. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So I want to emphasise this is an excellent place to go. Whoops. This is an excellent place to go. And there are other examples of excellent places that are open access as well. So this is not the only example. Okay. But this is one of the common ones. There's other journals that you'll see run by other groups that are also good. So what have the traditional journals done to compete? Because remember, this is a competition. Everybody wants the best articles. Everybody wants the best work. So what have other journals done? Well, the Lancet and JAMA and others have got a series. So for example, in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, there's the JAMA main journal, and then there's ophthalmology, dermatology, oncology, pediatrics, psychiatry, etc., etc., etc. They've created a stable of journals, so you have more choice where to publish. And the ranking of those journals is actually pretty good. All of them, because of the brand name, are pretty good. And they run on the traditional model. But it's easier to get into JAMA neurology than the main JAMA in terms of, getting in. So that's an alternative. Is that working for them? I haven't the foggiest idea. I think it is, but I haven't the foggiest idea whether it's really going to save them. My view, I doubt it. I doubt it. Gold open access. So gold open access is where you pay. Okay? That's what that means. So if you pay to an open access journal, that's a gold open access article, which means it has a different license to other journals that don't use that model. It means you can distribute your article around the world. You can send it to anybody you want. Okay? In essence, you own the copyright in gold open access. You can't republish it, but you own the copyright. If you publish in a traditional journal, the journal owns the copyright, which means you cannot freely distribute it everywhere, except where they allow you, and it's very specific rules. So it is important to understand what you're paying for. And if the license doesn't allow you to distribute it, don't sign it. Simple as that. But they usually do. So this is just really the disruptive innovation story yet again. It's just saying to you, there's a value proposition here, which means paying for this allows distribution. Anybody can download your article. Anybody can read it. But if nobody reads it, who cares? That's the problem. So there's a trade-off. It's classic business. Classic business, which is what we're talking about. And I'm not a business person. I'm an academic. I just need to understand this to run a journal like the MJA. All right, let's talk about predatory journals. Now, my one takeaway from this part, you must never publish in a predatory journal. You must never. If you can avoid it at all costs, you should try. So you need to understand this. Publishing in a predatory journal is equivalent to academic suicide. Promotion boards in some countries look at journal titles, and if they pick up it's a predatory journal, that's a big negative for promotion. You must never publish, and you will be tempted. And I can assure you, your colleagues have, including some of your senior colleagues, not necessarily here in Vietnam, but senior colleagues around the world have done so. Sometimes by mistake, sometimes deliberately. Because it's easy to publish in these journals. They want your article. They want your money. Just like the scammers want your money. Okay? It's a scam. It's a scam. It's like any other scam. They want your money, you pay for it, you get what you pay for. Nothing. Except disaster. So do not do so. They're all open access. I mean, I said most, but they do not print. They never print. Okay? First thing you do, if you want to publish in a journal you've never heard of, is you look at the website. Okay? You look at the website to work out what's going on, who they are. And then you do a search on the internet to see if they're predatory. And you can even enter the journal name with predatory next to it. And that will often come up with hits that will tell you. It's as simple as that. It's really easy. Okay. There was a chap called Jeffrey Beal in Colorado, a librarian. He created what he called Beal's List. So Beal's List is a list of predatory journals according to Beal. And what he did was, he did homework on each of the journals, and he said this is probably a predatory journal, and he published it. Now, almost everything on Beal's List is predatory. And the predatory journals came after him legally. And eventually the university shut Beal's List down. But there are alternate lists out on the internet that you can find as well. Beal's List, you can look it up, still circulates in some areas, but it's a little bit out of date now. There are other lists that can help you. Now, there were 420,000 articles published in 2014 in predatory journals. Where am I? 420,000, and it's going up every year. Now, there are quality metrics for journals. Any journal with an impact factor, doesn't matter what the number is not predatory almost always, with a few exceptions. There's a few predatory journals that sneaked in, but not many. So if it's got an impact factor, you're pretty safe, okay? And this is a number calculated by Clarivate, an external organisation, independently, for journals. Every journal that has an impact factor has to pass muster, has to have high quality, so-called editorial and peer review. So you can't get an impact factor unless you pass a test with them. Now, as I said, it doesn't always work, but almost always. The higher the impact factor number, the better the journal. So the New England Journal's impact factor is 85. 85. Yeah. Changes every year. That means over a 2-year average time period, articles in that journal get 85 cites each. Everything. Yeah, that's counted. Okay? That's really good. Okay? It's one of the top journals in the world. It's not actually the highest impact factor journal. The highest impact factor journal is CA. CA. It publishes all the cancer statistics, and everybody cites them. And so its impact factor is 200 plus. But it's not a journal you publish in, so it doesn't matter. So the New England Journal is the highest ranked impact factor journal, essentially, in the world. Essentially. Okay. If you're an open access journal without an impact factor, you can look on Scopus. This is all the Elsevier publications, or the Directory of Open Access Journals, DOAJ. If they're listed on DOAJ or Scopus, they've also passed a quality test. A number of predatory journals have made up impact factors. They don't always call them impact factors. They refer to them as this and then have a different symbol. Be very suspicious. If you can't work out what it is, if you've never heard of it, if it's not the impact factor or the DOAJ ranking or the Scopus ranking, don't believe it. Okay. I've said this already. This is, by the way, this is very rude, but forgive me, but this was actually true. This actually is what somebody has done because they're an academic receiving impact factor, receiving requests every day. I did not do this seriously did not, but my medical students like to see that, so I show it. So forgive me. But these are really difficult journals. There's another issue as well. These journals will sometimes list academics on their editorial advisory board that is false. So I know of academics who've been put on the editorial advisory board of predatory journals, which is really inappropriate. There have also been unfortunate instances of fake journals being published. This is very rare, but they do exist. And Merck published one of these and got into terrible trouble for it. It's not something that's happened more recently. So what's the impact factor? The impact factor is, this is how it's calculated. So basically, it's the number of times articles published in 2-year period are cited divided by the total number of citable items. And citable items are original research and review articles typically, not other articles. So the impact factor is very important to understand. Now, remember I said how the impact factor is calculated. But just look at journals like Science or PLOS One, and look at Nature as well, and then look at the range of citations for articles. So some articles get cited many, many times. This is one of the best journals in the world. This is Nature. And look at some of them as well. Some articles almost never get cited, even in the very, very, very best journal. So think about it. The impact factor is not a very good metric for telling you if your article will be cited. It's just a metric that tells you overall how the citations work. But it's skewed, the data, the impact factor number is skewed by the people up here who get cited an awful lot. And I think that's important to recognise. So I'm an editor of a journal, and I live and die by the impact factor number, sort of. Why is that? Because the ranking of my journal in the world depends on the impact factor. None of the other numbers anybody pays any attention to, unfortunately, just the impact factor. So the higher your impact factor, the more reputable your journal is, which is why Nature and Science and New England Journal, etc., are highly reputable journals. But remember this, Clarivate does the calculation, but it's a little bit opaque what gets counted and what doesn't get counted. So sometimes Clarivate gets it wrong, and sometimes the numbers just don't make sense. So this is one of the difficulties being an editor. It's not relevant to you, but it's relevant, well, to those who are not editors, but it's relevant to me. And then the more citations you have, the better your journal. So some journals will self-cite. There's a very famous example in Asia of a particular journal that had an impact factor of about 5, and the reason it had a high impact factor is it had lots of self-cites. It used to self-cite. It had about 30-40% of the time their own articles were being cited in every paper that they were publishing, which clearly had been manipulated by the editor to make sure that happened. Clarivate did pick this up and took away their impact factor for 2 years, punished them for misbehaving. So, important to know. And then there's no police. There's nobody out there controlling medical journal quality. It's a wild west in medical journals. It's the wild west. You can do what you like, and there's very little anybody can do about it. There are new predatory journals created every day, looking for business. If you ever receive an email saying, "We loved your paper in this journal, please send us your work," you know it's a predatory journal. You should delete the email. You should never send them anything ever, Period. Okay? It's a scam, like all the other internet scams that come. Because genuine journals don't solicit articles like that. They may invite you to write something. That will be an individual, very clear letter. But sometimes, and the predatory journals are getting better and better, the predatory journals are doing this too. They're sending individual letters. And they're going to get more sophisticated. It's going to be more difficult to pick them. So I think it's a real issue. And then, how do you know if it's been peer reviewed properly? How do you know? How do you know? Has anybody ever published, for those who published, received a peer review comment that says, I have no comments? Has anybody seen that? I have. Yeah, no comments at all. Please accept. That's not peer review. Clearly not. That's a real worry. It's a real alarm signal. There's been a problem in the peer review. Occasionally it'll happen in genuine peer review, but it shouldn't happen very much. How do you do this? And by the way, you can self-publish your articles now. You don't even need a journal. There are archives coming. People are starting to advertise them where you can publish your article online and get the peer review done after you publish. Now think about it. That means your paper, with all its errors and mistakes and problems, can get online and be considered true. And the only way you'd sort out if it wasn't true is look down to find what the peer reviewer said later, if anybody did respond. That's the model. There are serious people in my business who are promoting that idea. I think they're nuts, but that's just me. I think that's wrong. That's the problem. All right. I am going to ask everybody to stand up. Please stand up. Stand up. Everybody, please. Please. I'd like you to stretch. I'd like you to relax. I'd like you to talk to your neighbour for a moment. I'd just like you to stretch and get comfortable, because you've been sitting here for nearly an hour, and nobody can sit in the lecture theatre longer than an hour, at least in my view. I'm sorry for my senior. You didn't need to stand, but you can talk. Just relax. And when you're ready, we'll start again. So thank you for coming back. Who has been asked to be a peer reviewer? Hands up. Who's been asked to be a peer reviewer? Anybody? To do peer review, to be a peer reviewer for a journal. Who has done that? Anybody? No. Okay. So, you should volunteer. You should volunteer where possible. Because doing peer review is one of the best ways to learn about what's good and what's terrible and what's in between in terms of articles submitted to journals. It's a very good education. Who would like to be a medical journal editor? It's a great fun job. Who'd like to be a medical journal? Nobody. Oh no, there's a few people. It's actually really fun. Okay? I get to see the latest and greatest from my peers. I don't always publish it, but I get to see it. As a peer reviewer, you get to see articles before anybody else. Sometimes they're really, really important and really good. Yeah. So it's a way as an academic to become a thought leader in your field. So doing peer review is critical. If there's a local journal or an Asian journal locally that you can work with, provide peer review, whatever, act as an editor sometimes, Take the opportunity. It's a great learning experience. Now, I said to you already, the very basis of medical journals is peer review. The problem is peer review is flawed. Think about it. Think about it. You send your article to me. I'm the editor. I'll do a peer review, kind of, like a quick peer review. I'll look to see if I like the article. If it's fatally flawed, I'll reject you immediately. If it's totally uninteresting, I'll probably, sadly, also reject immediately. But if it's interesting and seems methodologically reasonable, I'll send it to a content reviewer. That means an expert in that field. I'm not a stroke neurologist. You can't expect me as an editor to know all about stroke neurology. I just don't. I know a little bit actually, but I don't know everything. So I'll send it to stroke experts who will review the article for me. Now think about it. If you're selected to be a peer reviewer, that says you're an expert. That's really nice. So think about it. It's actually worth doing. But think about this too. Let's say I send it to one of you and ask for your peer review. And I send it to someone else and ask for their peer review. What happens if the first person says this is a wonderful article and the science is excellent and it's well done and it's got large numbers and the statistics are all great? That's reviewer one. You should accept it, editor. It's got a few things to fix, but it's good. And the second reviewer says, this is the worst article I've ever read on the topic. It's irrelevant. We already know all this. It's fatally flawed. It's wrong. Here's where it's wrong. Here's the list. And by the way, the editor never sends you those first comments, just the list of, issues to fix. So what does the editor do? Does the editor accept it or reject it? What do you think? What does the editor do? So I'm not a stroke expert. Stroke expert 1 says this is a wonderful paper. Stroke expert 2 says this is a terrible paper, and I'm the editor. What do I do? What would you do? Third reviewer. That's right, we go to a third reviewer, maybe even a fourth reviewer, maybe even a fifth reviewer. Yeah. So we do 4 reviewers. 2 say it's excellent, publish it. 2 say not that good or reject. What do I do? I'm the editor. I have the peer review. I have to make a decision. This is a common scenario. It's easy when all the reviewers say it's terrific. It's easy when all the reviewers say it's terrible. But often, it's somewhere in the middle. So the editor has to be good because they have to make a judgment call based on this. How do we handle it at the MJA? Just like the New England Journal, just like JAMA, just like BMJ, just like the Lancet. We have what's called the hanging committee. All the editors sit round the table with all the peer review comments. There's a statistician who reviews the stats, and we make a decision. And sometimes we say that's excellent peer review and we agree, and sometimes we say that's terrible peer review and we don't agree. But that requires resources, it's expensive, and that's the problem with that model. But it's a very good model for quality control. But if you look at general journals, many journals, peer review is not very good. So here's the former editor of the British Medical Journal criticising peer review. This is a list of his criticisms of peer review. He's very, very critical. You know, one of the problems is sometimes the peer reviewers are biased because they're competitors of the authors who've published the work. So think about it. If you're a group studying I don't know, studying stomach cancer, and your competitor sends a paper to the New England Journal on stomach cancer, and you're doing the same work on stomach cancer, but your paper hasn't been submitted yet, you're a competitor. You see their paper, you don't want their paper published maybe. You may feel you cannot do a proper review. Now, what the reviewer should do in this setting is refuse to peer review, to say, I won't peer review it, I'm biased. But they don't do that very often. They will peer review it and tear it to pieces. Because every article, every study, every experiment has potential flaws. Doesn't matter what you do. Doesn't matter how you do it. Doesn't matter who does it. There are potential flaws in every single experiment. This is the problem. And of course, it doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means you can tear things to pieces if you know what you're doing. So it's a real problem. So this idea it's subjective is a concern. At the MJA, we try to deal with this by doing double-blind peer review. The authors don't know, the reviewers don't know who wrote the paper. The trouble is, if you know the field very well, you can pick the writing style of your competitors. I know exactly who's written papers sometimes, even with double-blind peer review. So that's one of the issues. Anyway, so there are lots of criticisms of peer review. Peer review is not perfect. Thank you. Now, there have been experiments about peer review. You can do research on anything, including peer review. So this was a wonderful study done by the MJA many years ago, which tried to see whether if you made peer review open, if you made it available for people to, write about this before you published it or even after you published it, would you get responses? And basically, you publish the reviewer comments. And the outcome of this study was reviewers were less likely to be critical if they knew their review was going to be published, which doesn't help anybody, particularly us as editors. We need peer reviewers to be very critical. We need peer reviewers to pick up flaws. What we don't need is peer reviewers to be rude and obnoxious when they do it, which sometimes they are, but that's a different problem. All right. And then Nature did an experiment about a decade or so ago, where they actually displayed papers for open reviewer comments. And most people just didn't write anything. So that doesn't work. So this idea you can just put it out there and get decent peer review didn't seem to work. So this idea that's now current, where people are suggesting this be the model, that you submit your paper, it's published online, then you get peer review. I don't think it's viable based on this data and other data, but that's an issue. And then there was this experiment. This was a fascinating experiment. So this was a scientific writer with a science background. He wrote a fake paper. Totally fake. Absolutely fake. Okay, now, he wrote it very well. It was basic science. He wrote a really good paper, and he included in the paper fatal flaws. Fatal. Like, if you did this, this experiment was invalid. Absolutely fatal. Fatal. Okay, think about that. So if you picked those up, you would reject this paper immediately, if you picked it up. Okay, fatal flaws, but very well written. Okay, very nice paper. So he sent it to 160 journals on the Directory of Open Access Journals, so these are all open access, and 121 from Beale's list. That's the list of predatory journals. Think about it, okay? Okay. On Beale's list, well, of the 157 genuine journals, 98 rejected. Think about it. 59 failed to pick up the fatal flaws. 59 journals. In other words, when people submit bad science, it can get through good journals. Now, Beale's list was interesting. 82% accepted it. So, what do you expect? Interestingly, a few journals actually obviously do peer review, even though they're predatory on the list, or so-called predatory. So perhaps they weren't as bad as Beale thought. However, think about it, predatory journals accept fake science. Yeah, they do. They don't do a proper review. And even on this DOAJ list, 45% of them accepted the fake paper. PLOS and PLOS One rejected it. Because it's a good journal. Good journal, good editors, good science, do a good job. But look, this raises all sorts of issues about peer review. Even if it gets proper peer review, mistakes get made. Fatally flawed articles get through. Fatally flawed. And sometimes those flaws are hard to pick up. So you need very rigorous processes to publish stuff. Now, the New England Journal would say this never happens to it. It never publishes mistakes. The editors told me that's true. I don't believe it, but that's what he says. Even the very best journals can make a mistake. Yep. So we have a problem. And then we've got another problem. There aren't enough people volunteering to be peer reviewers. There's actually so many articles being published that we're running into the issue of how do you find people who are willing to peer review, who'll do a good job, who'll be diligent, who'll think about the article carefully. And that's a real problem. And then you've got terrible, egregious episodes by scientists. This is one of the worst, where researchers actually sent an article in and they were asked who should be my peer reviewers, and they gave a list of names. The journal editor sent the article to those people, but the people who received it were the authors of the paper, who then did their own peer review saying the paper was wonderful. So they wrote the paper, gave a fake email, wrote the peer review. I mean, that's criminal. That's just criminal. Yeah. So, I don't recommend it, by the way. Don't recommend it. No. All right. So, there's not as much evidence as I'd like there to be that says peer review always works. In fact, I think the evidence says it often fails. Where there's not been much work is on what the editor does. I think the editor becomes the most important person or group of persons in the journal, not the peer reviewers. I have thrown out peer review. I have accepted peer review comments because I will do my own methodological assessment of that paper. Because the content reviewers can tell you, is the story interesting and important? But they can't always tell you the science is robust. So the job of the editor is to make sure the science is robust as it can be. And if we do that and we like the article, we'll publish it. I've already talked about the hanging committee, and we'll come to it. And then there's all sorts of things happening in the journal world you need to know about. For example, you need to make your data available in the 21st century. You need to be able to understand that if you publish an article, someone may ask to look at your data. Even the journal may ask. I have on occasions, a few occasions, asked for the data. Not very often, because it's a lot of work to do something with it. A lot of work. But I have. So I think you need to be aware this is a check and balance. You know, you need to have your data available. You need to be able to make it available. And in the future, all data published will be in a repository somewhere that someone else can look at. I guarantee it. That is coming. That is the future. So be ready for that. That's a quality control too. Remember, you can go back and look at someone's data and say, goodness me, what have they done? Rather than just looking at what's in the published manuscript. And there's all sorts of other things happening, like clinical trial registration. Every clinical trial needs to have a pre-specified endpoint. As a journal editor, I want to see what that is. Routinely we look at that, because sometimes people change the endpoint based on the results, which invalidates the clinical trial to some extent. So that's important. And by the way, do not change your pre-specified endpoint, period. Just do not. Okay. Now, John Inodonis is a Stanford professor, very famous. And he says most of the articles published in the medical literature are wrong. Isn't he a cheery soul? A cheery soul. 80%, he says, is wrong. Yeah, he's very cheery when you talk to him. And I think he has a point. He has a point. There's a lot of studies that are published that never can be reproduced. So the data they publish is correct. It's just that it's not true. So they haven't mispublished, they haven't misled, they haven't done anything wrong. It's just not reproducible. I've always believed, as a medical researcher, I need to replicate my results if it's an important new concept. Really important. I think that's a principle every researcher should keep in mind. If you find something brand new, you're not just confirming someone else's work, you find something brand new, make sure you do a confirmatory study. I think that's critical. And sometimes you need to do more than one. And tomorrow, when I talk about some of my research, we've done several confirmatory studies for some of our new hypotheses because, well, we had to convince ourselves we were correct, let alone anyone else. Even meta-analyses. Remember, these are the gold standard for evidence-based medicine. Meta-analyses. You combine all the clinical trials together, for example, and you come up with the truth. But if you don't combine them right, you come up with the wrong answer. And what we found in this study from some years ago now, we won a prize for it, but that's not relevant, is even the experts don't seem to be able to read papers well to do meta-analyses. And this taught me that if you're going to do a meta-analysis, which, by the way, as a clinical researcher is a skill set you should acquire, because it's a very easy way to publish, but you need to do them extremely well. Extremely well. Okay? If you don't do them well, you get the wrong answer. So in this study, they made all sorts of mistakes. They just made multiple errors. And this was the gold standard organisation. This was the Cochrane Review organisation. So these are supposed to be people who know what they're doing. So, meta-analyses can be wrong. Individual studies can be wrong. It doesn't mean they're all wrong. It just means some of them can be wrong. So my advice as a scientist is believe no one. Confirm everything. Remain skeptical. Don't believe experts. Experts are wrong. Often. That's your job as a researcher, is to get to the truth. We don't care what people think. We care what's true. Truth is what research is about, not about the expert says. In fact, when the expert says, I often think, is that true? What's the evidence? Oh yes, there's really good evidence, that's true. Oh, that's terrible evidence. I'm not sure I believe that at all. That's research. I can do a study on that. So listen to the experts, just don't believe them. Well, not all of them anyway. Well, not everything they say anyway. Except me, of course. Believe me, I'm always right. All right. And this is what I said here, actually. I really think this is true. Science is about knowledge accumulation, rethinking, reconsideration, reviewing. That's what science is. Science isn't about this is truth, this is not truth. It's about where is the truth and let's get to it and work towards it. So remember that. That's the exciting part. It's like being an explorer and getting to the end of the road. So I think inner donus is wrong, but that's okay. At least partly wrong. All right. I want to say this too, and this is important. You know, we are becoming more and more interested in publishing work that translates, that changes things, that does something, and doesn't take 20 years to do so. So that's one of our mantras at the MJA. What can we publish that will change practice? Guidelines are a good piece of that. So guidelines for clinicians we publish because they change practice if anybody reads them. Now, there's good data, even guidelines are ignored. I'm not sure what happens in Vietnam, but in my country they are. So we're working on how we can deal with this. It's not relevant to today's presentation except to say that interests us. And if you want to look at our own data, I mentioned the page views of the MJA and how we're doing, and we're pleased people are reading us. I hope you might even look at the MJA online. By the way, all of the research in the Medical Journal of Australia, all of it, the research, the authors pay nothing, and it's all freely available to read. Yep. So we're one of the few journals in the world that makes our original research freely available regardless of whether you paid or not. Most people don't pay, or usually don't. And we do that as a public service. But our journal is not all gold open access. And in fact, what authors sign is not the gold open access signature unless they pay gold open access. So it's a little bit different. We call the journal a hybrid journal. Anyway. And we're one of those independent journals that publishes all sorts of things that are relevant to health and medicine more globally and generally. And so that's what's fun about being an editor. I get to deal with things, and then I try not to make mistakes. We all make mistakes. My friend Richard Horton made one at one point when he came into the politics of the Gaza Strip. I avoid certain areas very much, but anyway. All right. Finally, how do you get published? How do I get published in a major journal, or in fact in any journal? So let's talk about it. First of all, I've already told you, for the major journals, you're more likely to be rejected than accepted. My first piece of advice is grow a thick skin. Be ready to be rejected. Okay? I have been rejected more times than I can count. All right? More times than I can count, I have been rejected. And I still get rejected today. I get very annoyed too, like everybody does, but I get rejected. Sometimes for very good reasons, the editor's right. Sometimes for very bad reasons, I think the editor's wrong. But that's okay. So get used to being rejected. If you don't like being rejected, find something else to do. All right? Because that's the norm. Okay, so don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. but do a good job when you submit. You need to convince the editor for most journals, except some of the open access. You need to convince the editor your work is worthy. It's your job, not their job, your job. If you can't convince them, you won't get published. So you have to write the paper with this in mind. I need to convince them. I need to show that my work is robust, is high quality. I need to show in the methods that it can be reproduced. That if I wanted to, I could do exactly what you've told me and come up with a similar answer, hopefully. If you don't write it that way, you haven't got a hope ever of appearing in a major journal. Ever. Okay? So you must do this. It's really important. So think about why, before you do the research, think about why you're doing it. What's your question? Is it a good question or questions? If it's a bad question, find a good question. Seriously, don't do a bad question. Is it important? What happens if my results are negative? Can it still be published? If the answer is no, if it's negative, I can't get it published, find a new project. I don't know how many times my results have been negative, not infrequently, but it's always publishable. It's an important negative if it's negative, not an irrelevant negative nobody cares about. So it's got to be a question that matters. Yes or no, it doesn't matter what the answer is, it's got to be important. Think about it. And there are millions of questions. There are millions in every single subspecialty field. Every one. Millions of questions unanswered. Unanswered. You just have to find them and answer them, or try to. So, you've got to write it well. Now remember, systematic reviews, meta-analyses, they're great for understanding the field, for learning what the field says now. We actually ask all our PhD students to write a systematic review or meta-analysis. So systematic review means you have a protocol for searching the literature, identifying the articles, putting it together. And a meta-analysis is the quantification of those results. So we ask that. And I suggest for people who are starting clinical research, learn how to do these things. Systematic reviews and meta-analyses. But do them well. Do them well. It's a bit like medicine. Just imagine the doctor practicing on your mother. Do you want them to be good, really competent, really careful, or do you want them to be sloppy and don't care and just do whatever? What do you want? I know what I want. And in research, I want the same. I want the same. Now, I'm going to assume you've done the research, you've got a great question, you've got the results, and now you're trying to write the paper. So I'm going to start there. I'll come back to some other things in a minute. Okay. So, fact number one. The editor will read your abstract first. In fact, everyone in the world will read your abstract first. In fact, most people in the world will never read your paper. They'll only ever read your abstract if they ever read it. Your abstract has to be the best thing ever. Has to be the best part of your paper. Has to be fantastic. And it's really hard because you've only got a limited number of words. Okay. So you've got to write the abstract and you've got to write it well. I mean, it's very hard to be specific, but there's a few obvious errors you see in abstracts. You see no data. No data. So this is science, results, no data. They make some vague statements. Well, that's a dead abstract, probably a dead paper, even before you've submitted it. Don't submit that. They just give p-values. P-values mean nothing. P-values mean, probability values mean Statistical significance, yes, but you have no idea of how big the effect is. The effect size is what clinically and usually in all science matters. So if you've got 1 million patients and you get a p-value less than 0.05, that means nothing. That's not clinically relevant. That's not biologically relevant necessarily. If the effect size is tiny, it doesn't matter what the p-value is. The p-value only tells you it's different from another group, from your comparison, for example. So p-values alone, never, never, never write those in abstracts. Put in confidence limits, put in effect sizes like odds ratios or relative risks or hazard ratios or whatever's relevant to the science you're doing. But don't, or even mean values and standard deviations is better than just a p-value. So don't just do p-values. Your introduction is your chance to say why I did this. It's the only thing you're writing about. Why is this a question worth asking? Whatever the question is, it doesn't matter. That's all your introduction is trying to do. And it gives you a chance to state your hypothesis. Your a priori, your initial hypothesis before you started the experiment. That's all you need to do. Your methods must explain what you did so someone else could do it too. And that's all you have to do. Your results need to be logical and followable and sensible. And some scientific disciplines are different. Some people will write comments in results. But in most medical journals anyway, the commentary is left to discussion. It's not in the results section. Now there are science journals that are different, and I have written for those. And I find it very hard to write those because it's hard to do this. But mostly it's not that way. And look, very simple techniques. Write logically. Simple analyses, more complex analyses if you need to follow. You don't reproduce the results both in the results section written and in the tables. You try to minimize the overlap. Figures tell much more than anything. As an editor, I will often look at your figure. If your figure tells me your data are screwy, sorry for the word, are strange compared to what you've said, you're in trouble, okay? But you should have recognised that before you submitted it. The figures really help you interpret your own data and editors and reviewers interpret it. I know scientists who look at the hypothesis and go straight to the figures. They don't even read anything else. They look at the figures first in scientific reviews or peer review of, to fund you. That's what they do. And they say, look at this figure, isn't this fantastic? Or look at this figure. What are they saying? That makes no sense. Yeah, so really important. Good figures matter. Get your references right. Oh my gosh, as an editor, one of the most frustrating things is you misquote the reference. So what you say isn't what the reference says. Or you've got the references in random order, so you've got, basically irrelevant or misnumbered, or you've got duplicate references. Simple stuff. If you write a sloppy paper, my first impression as an editor is the science just as sloppy? And if I think your science is sloppy, you don't get published. So write it well. It's important. Write it like your life depends on it being correct, and it'll help you. And abbreviations. In science, we love abbreviations, but I don't know what most of them mean. I mean, think about it. You want to tell a story. I really think some of the best science I've ever read tells a story. When you've got abbreviations all the way through it, you know, this and that and this and that, and every second sentence is 5 abbreviations and you can't even remember what the last one was and you have to go back and look. That's not telling a story. That's obscuring the story. Don't do it. Use very common abbreviations, but don't overdo it. It's a pet hate of mine, but I know people who get completely lost in their own papers with abbreviations. I'm sure they don't know what they mean either. Very confusing. And the tables and figures. I should be able to look at your figure with a legend and understand exactly what it says without looking at anything else. And the same for the tables. If you can't, redo it till you can. Yeah. Simple stuff, but it makes a huge difference to getting through the process. Remember, you have to convince the editor and the peer reviewers that this work is worth publishing. Not their job, it's your job. It's actually not hard. It's actually easy. Once you get this right, you just do it. Just easy. You just have to do it. You've done all the work. You just haven't done this bit, which is the easy bit. I always write the methods first. I know the methods. The hardest thing for my students is to start writing the paper. Start. Blank piece of paper, blank computer screen, my first paper ever. What do I write? What do I write? How do I write this? I've never written a paper before. You've done the methods. Presumably you've written a protocol for the methods. I'll recommend that as well. Just write the methods. It's what you did. If you don't know what you did, you're in big trouble. This is science. If you don't know what you did, you can't write the paper anyway. But if you know what you did, you can write the paper. Just write what you did and write it clearly. Okay. I write the methods first. I write the discussion last. Discussion is the hardest. Discussion is interpretation of the data. That is hard. Even for me sometimes, I can struggle in a new area of research because it's hard. You have to have read the literature and interpret it against what you found. So write the discussion last. So methods, results, introduction, abstract, because that's all easy, relatively, then discussion. Discussion last. That's what I do anyway. I can write a paper in a day, but it's not a good paper. It's written. It needs redrafting and redrafting and redrafting and redrafting. I had a mentor in the United States at Mayo Clinic. I arrived at Mayo Clinic as a postdoctoral fellow. I'd written 20 papers. I was good, I thought. I arrived. I got there the first weekend and I thought to myself, I'm very bored. I'll write a review article on my work, on the work I'd done for the last several years. So I wrote the review. I'm actually a pretty good writer, pretty good. I wrote it in a weekend. I drafted it 5 or 6 times in that weekend. It was good. It was excellent. I thought very good English. I liked it. I gave it to, and I knew the field. I gave it to him. And I got it back 3 days later. Every line in the paper had a red line through it. Every line. Every word needs changing. Every sentence needed readjusting. Some of it needed repositioning here according to him. And you know what? Even though what I'd written was pretty good, after his comments, it was much better. It was better. It was excellent. And it got published in one of the top journals. So, ask for peer review from your colleagues. Get them to read it. Get someone critical. Don't get someone who's nice. Get someone who's tough. Who'll say to you, look, I like this, but I don't understand this, and this makes no sense, and by the way, this is silly, and and oh my goodness, and the figures I don't understand at all, and blah-de-blah-de-blah. Get someone tough. Get a few tough people. Be tough as a peer review. Your job is to help your colleagues, not to get in the way. Help them. Help them. It really helps. And of course the English matters, unfortunately, in the current world. I'm sorry that it's an English predominant world for publishing, but it is. And if you need help with that, get help. Some journals will help you with English. They will help you with that as well. So look at that if that's available. Sometimes you have to pay, sometimes it's free. It depends on the journal. But you do need to write it as well as you can. There's a little bit of an art form to that, but you can learn it. So you might say, oh gosh, my English isn't as good as it needs to be. You can learn to do this. This is scientific writing, not literature. Quite different. So lots of drafts. If you like where do you send your article? Where do I send my article? Well, I want to send it to the New England Journal because that's obviously the best place in the world, isn't it? But I need to be reasonably sure they'd be interested. How do I know? Well, obviously it's a combination of factors. Look at your references. Who have you cited? Which journals have you cited in your literature? If your literature review cites Nature, Science, Cell, you're not going to send it to the New England Journal. That's the wrong place. It needs to be a basic science journal. It needs to be as good as you can get for maybe one of the journals that's in your citation list. If you've cited New England Journal 20 times, well, maybe that's the place to try, although it's tough to get in. And remember, it doesn't matter if they reject you, because you'll get peer review maybe. And if you get peer review, it'll help you revise it. So you don't care. I don't care where. I'll send it anywhere. I don't care. As long as they'll review it, it's really good for me. So think about that. That's the benefit for you of submitting somewhere. Costs you nothing to send it to the New England Journal. And if you get peer review, because by the way, they can reject outright, so you may not get that. But if you get peer review, that can help you a lot. And they might even accept it. They might. So I was on the floor, service floor at Mayo Clinic doing rounds with my team, and we came across a case I'd never seen before. Very complex medical problem. Had multi-system issues, had a polyendocrinopathy and had some renal impairment and had a bunch of stuff. And we finally made a diagnosis of what's called the POEMS syndrome. For those who are hematologically trained, you may have heard of it, quite rare. So we decided, well, we'd look up all the cases at Mayo Clinic of POEMS syndrome. It's a rare disease. I'd never seen a case. So we looked up every case. We put that together as a big series. We looked at whether they survived. We followed them up through the records, etc. And then we sent it off. I said, well, we'll send it to the New England Journal. Got nothing to lose. They published it. I'm a gastroenterologist. They published it. Seriously, it's one of my most cited papers. It's a very good paper. Yeah, POEMS syndrome. On the GI service, because they had some GI problems as well, but one we saw. So don't be afraid to try, just be prepared to be rejected. Because what have you got to lose? All right. Now, this is for clinical research, not basic. Okay, if you're a clinical researcher, there's a hierarchy of study designs in terms of getting published. Randomized controlled trials, well done, good chance of getting published. People like RCTs. They're well done, they are highly publishable. Good question, proper design, analysed properly, terrific. Highly relevant. For clinical researchers, hard work but worth doing. Because they're randomised, the biases tend to be minimised. Not excluded, but minimised. Large cohort studies, following people up over time. This is why databases and biobanks matter. Following people over time. They're great studies. Ask the right question. Great studies. Case control can be good, can be terrible. Depends how you select the cases, depends how you select the controls, lots of potential bias, very common study design for answering questions, but of course it's retrospective, not prospective. So you're looking backwards, not forwards. And case reports, for people starting out, case reports are good practice in writing, but they don't add a lot of value otherwise. I don't know what people think here about case reports. The MJA does not accept case reports, for example. We don't accept them. We do something called lessons from practice, where if someone has a very interesting case that has a lesson for the community, we'll publish that, but it's not a case report, it's an educational series, really. But we don't publish case reports, we don't think they're valuable. But there are journals that do, and for some junior researchers, it's not a bad way to get a paper and get started off. So I recommend trying it, but it's not science, not really. Making it through peer review, I've already said a lot of this, but the glaring weakness we see in papers, besides poor hypotheses, are poor analyses. Okay? So this is harder. I, for example, have a biostatistician on my team. I do. And he's fantastic, and I couldn't do without him, because I want to be sure that statistical methods we apply are really robust. Now, that's not available to everybody, but all I can say is this: if you want to do clinical, basic science is a little easy because the statistical methods are pretty simple. You know, chi-squared tests, etc. Simple. But in clinical research, you have to adjust for confounders. You have to do more complex analyses. So I think there you do need statistical support unless you can train yourself. I know people, some of my colleagues, who are very good biostatisticians themselves. They've trained themselves. I've done statistical training as part of my clinical research training. But I am not a biostatistician. And I'm not silly enough. So think about the analogy. You know, so what's a good analogy? Would you, if you had a very complicated medical problem, would you prefer to see a generalist, someone who's a general doctor, or a super specialist in your area? Who would you prefer, a super specialist or a generalist? I want the super specialist if it's a complicated disease. I don't want the generalist who doesn't know much about it. Well, I'm a generalist. I'm a generalist statistician. I know the basics. I know the simple stuff. I can do it too, but I'm not a specialist. So if you haven't got if you've got the chance to either have a specialist or create a specialist or work with a specialist or collaborate with somebody, take it. And that's one of the pieces of advice I do have for you if it's possible. Most universities have statisticians in the university somewhere, so it may be a way to go. You also need to power your studies when you're planning them. Think about it. An RCT, a randomised trial. If it's too small, you may not see any difference, even though there's a real difference that matters. So you've got to power them right, and typically a statistician can help you with those power calculations, although online there's plenty of software available to do it yourself. It's just that sometimes you put the numbers in wrong. You haven't got the right assumptions, which matters. Now, I went to Mayo Clinic. I spent a long time there, and I learned a lot. And this is one of the things I learned. You write a protocol. You don't do research without a protocol. Okay? And the protocol describes your methods and helps you to think about how to get the study right before you start. It's a bit like a recipe. Think about cooking something, cooking a wonderful Vietnamese meal. I mean, if you're not an expert, you need a recipe. If you don't follow the recipe, you get the wrong outcome. It's just the same in research. It's a recipe. I need the right recipe to get the right outcome. Yeah. And so I think it's really important. And we used to peer review internally our protocols. This is my advice to faculty. Peer review the protocols. You raise the standard of what you do internally. And it gives you practice being a peer reviewer, which I said is good for you anyway, which it is. Okay. Even with all of this, I used to get rejected, still do. But I want to emphasize it matters. There are checklists for study designs. You should look at the checklist. You should know these checklists. If your study design is a randomised trial, the consort statement you need to look at. It tells you what you need to have done, and actually you should look at it before you start the study so you know you're going to do everything. It's actually a really good tool for helping you design your study. The same for cohort studies, the same for observational studies, the same for meta-analyses. It's all there. It's all available. It's never used to be there. This is fantastic stuff. As a clinical researcher, they tell you how to do the recipe. It's just there. You just have to do it. So think about that. Many journals require you to have this statement included when you submit, including us. So that's important. There are some issues to talk about authorship and other things. So remember, we require, for example, and so do all the journals in the ICMJE grouping, we require all authors fulfill these requirements now. This has changed over time. So we don't give guest authorship, that means people who've done nothing but just get on the paper anyway, that's frowned on now. That's not acceptable. So even the senior author has to do something more than just have their name on the paper. They have to contribute. Professional medical writers, sometimes you can get help like this. There are people who offer services. You need to declare their use. That's the rule. Used to be different, but now it's the rule. Declare their use. So there are some don'ts, big don'ts. Don't do any of this. Don't submit to more than one journal at a time. Just don't. Just don't. People have, but don't. Don't submit it even if it's a different language in this journal and that. No. Don't. Get ethics approval or whatever's equivalent in your country, in your university, for human research. Salami slicing's difficult. Think about it. You do a big study and you have lots of questions. And so you may write several papers, and that's fine. But sometimes people kind of don't do that. They take a piece of data that should all be put together and they split it up anyway to get more papers. Now, it's a bit of a grey zone when it's salami slicing and when it's not. It's a judgment call. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not. So make the judgment. So salami slicing isn't so terrible unless you really are overdoing it, but be careful. Don't plagiarise. We use plagiarism software. We actually check. We run it through Authenticate, and it comes up percentage of overlap with any publication somewhere else. It's amazing when we do it. And don't fabricate. Oh my gosh, don't fabricate. Don't say you had an animal control group when you had no control group. Just don't do that. Okay, that's the end of you if it ever gets caught. And by the way, it kills science because it's not true. It's false. It's really bad. Making a mistake is not the same as telling a lie which misleads investigators. Oh, that's terrible. Conflicts of interest. You have to declare them. What's a conflict of interest? Some obvious ones, like you're funded by somebody, you need to declare that. Somebody's paid you to do it, that's okay, just declare it. But you need to declare it because that's important. Sometimes people say, I have no conflicts at all, and they've been paid by somebody and somebody funded it and bloody... that's pretty silly, particularly if you find out. So don't do that. Declare it. It's better to declare it. Better to over-declare it. And then it's irrelevant, but that's okay. Plagiarism, I've already mentioned. Be very careful. So don't copy chunks of text from anybody. Okay, you have to write it yourself. It's important. So what happens when your paper's submitted? So what happens at the MJA and other journals like us is the administrator receives it and a deputy editor or an editor gets to look at it. This is your only chance to impress the deputy or the medical editor, okay? If they can reject you outright with no peer review, no comments, you get no reasons, you get no feedback, that's not helpful. So you need to have a paper that's good enough to get through that part of it. So that's important. If it's good enough, it'll go to assuming the editor gets it right, it'll go to peer review. They will send their comments. The editor will review those comments with other editors, in our case, with the commentary, with statistical input to make a decision. Should you send reviewer lists if asked? My golden rule is never tell them who you'd like to review your paper. Okay? It doesn't matter what you say, whoever's on that list of preferred reviewers is considered biased by the editor, typically. And it could be biased positively or negatively. I've seen people who've said, this is my preferred reviewer. You send the paper to the preferred reviewer, who then attacks the paper in the most vicious way I've ever seen. I've seen that many times. In other words, they're biased against the paper, not for it. They're against it. The author never knows that's what they think, but that's what they do. And then sometimes reviewers are overly positive, and if you've nominated a peer reviewer who says this is a wonderful paper, the editor thinks, well, maybe they're biased in favour. So don't tell them unless they require it. Now I'll tell you something I probably shouldn't. If they insist I list people to review it, I always list people I really hope will never see the paper. I list the people I would prefer never see the paper. Yep. Because I don't care. Whatever they say, I think the editors will be thinking about bias, so I don't really ever want to put the reviewers who I'm desperately hoping might see the paper, because I think that's better. Safer. I've already really talked about this. The editor decides the peer reviewers do not decide what happens to the paper. Peer reviewers provide advice only. Some peer reviewers get very confused about this. I've seen peer reviewers say, but I rejected the paper and you've accepted it. Yes, absolutely true. Absolutely right. Do it all the time. What's the problem? Occasionally peer reviewers think they've picked a fatal flaw that isn't fatal, that can be fixed, or in fact isn't a flaw at all, it's just their biased view. So you've got to be very careful to understand your role as a peer reviewer is an advisor only, not in control. Sometimes that line is difficult for some people, but it's important to recognise. Now, if your paper is accepted without any difficulty, be worried you've got a predatory journal. It's extremely rare for papers to be accepted with no change. It does happen. It's happened to me once or twice, to really good journals. It happened to me once or twice. That's it. Every other time I've had to revise it in some way. Even if it's minor revisions, I've had to revise it. So expect to have to revise your paper for any kind of reputable journal. If you don't have to revise it, be very, very, very worried. And if you're really worried, withdraw your paper. Do not publish in a predatory journal. It will only hurt you, seriously. And there'll be plenty out there that'll want your papers, but not for the right reason. Yep. But you will hit the jackpot occasionally, so see what happens. All right, here's the team in the room talking about, this, actually not talking about research in this case, but this is our hanging committee room where we accept or reject papers or ask for changes twice a week. So get used to it. Now, if you get rejected, what do you do? Now, you can appeal. Many journals allow appeals. But if you're going to appeal, you'll have to revise the paper and have a very good reason for the appeal. In other words, you're going to have to address all the comments and then appeal, and they may still reject you outright. So you can appeal, but your chances of success are not very high, but you can appeal. Don't do what some people do. So I had one author that I know very well who got rejected and then wrote an angry email to everyone in the country, and me included, on the list. There was this huge list of people that she wrote the email to. Huge list of, oh, this is terrible, and my paper's fantastic, and these editors are stupid, and, you know, how could they be so ridiculous, and why would they reject this wonderful piece of work, etc., etc., etc. Now, all that did was annoy me, and it did not help her, you know, and so seriously, don't do that. You need to accept rejection as part of this. If you get peer review and editor comments, look at them critically, revise your paper. If a reviewer has a genuine concern, think about how you might address it in the revised paper before you send it to another journal. Improve your paper. Now, if the comments are ridiculous, you don't have to, you can ignore them, but typically they're not. Typically they're quite helpful. So use them to help you. If you get a revision chance, don't blow it. Okay, so the paper's gone in, it comes back, and they say, we'd like you to revise it. But if you don't do it properly, we won't accept it. There's often letters sort of a bit like that. Use the opportunity to revise, try to do the work. Often in basic science, there'll be new experiments required. That's typical of basic science. In clinical research, it's more about fixing analyses, perhaps doing additional hypothesis generating analyses, etc., which you need to do. If they want you to do a particular analysis, think hard about doing it rather than just saying no, if you can. All right. And that can be tough, and it can take time. And that's not relevant. So, as an academic, as a PhD student, as somebody who's interested in medicine and health, you need to publish, but you don't need to perish as well. So don't perish as you publish. So, you know, you want to submit high quality work. You want to avoid some of the risks that I've talked about. All right. So I'm going to finish in a moment. I'd say a few more things. So this is a time of great disruption. I do not know what's going to happen to medical journals. My prediction, we will disappear. But the science published will remain. You will be able to find it. You'll be able to cite it. It will still be important. It just may not be in a medical journal like is the current model. I can imagine, for example, we'll use AI, artificial intelligence, to create our own personalised medical journal every week that turns up on our desk with all the articles we're fascinated by, with all the articles that we're particularly interested in from all over the world, all presented to us as we wish. That would be a nice model for free. Yep, I could imagine that. So in other words, as you change your interests, the algorithms move with you. That can be done today. It's fascinating. But it's a time of great disruption for all of us. Certain journals have a purpose besides just publishing data. For example, the general medical journals like MJA, like New England Journal, like The Lancet, I think we have more of a role in professional development and in changing the way the landscape of medicine is practiced and done. And that's an important role for us. And we take that very seriously. So we just don't publish research. We hope we're changing the world. And we're trying to do it in a positive way if we can. But I also think there are too many journals, too many papers. Nobody can read the literature in their own field. And that becomes a real issue for all of us. And as I've said, I think we're going to have big changes that you'll see in your lifetime. And I think in 20, 30 years' time, when I'm long gone, you'll be here listening to someone else. Perhaps one of you will be giving this talk about being a medical editor. I hope so. And talking about the changes that have occurred over the last period and the way we now learn and digest and publish that will be quite different to what's happening now. But for the moment, I don't care. For the moment, I am here to publish the best work that comes to us. And I will continue to do so in the most rigorous fashion possible. And we welcome submissions, but as I've said, it's tough to get in, and we will continue to do the best we can to be the best possible journal we can to serve our readers, to serve the public, to serve the experts, to serve politicians and bureaucrats, because that's what we're supposed to do. So thank you very much.
Xin cảm ơn giáo sư. Thank you very much, Professor Talley. Bây giờ đến phần rất là quan trọng của ngày hôm nay. Chắc chắn là ở trong đây sẽ có nhiều học viên sau đại học, nhất là nghiên cứu sinh. Yêu cầu của nghiên cứu sinh muốn tốt nghiệp đó là sẽ có bài báo quốc tế. Cũng như là sau này yêu cầu ai muốn có học hàm lớp thì cũng phải có bài báo quốc tế. Như vậy thì xin mời quý đồng nghiệp ở trong hội trường này đặt câu hỏi. Có thể là đặt câu hỏi trực tiếp hoặc là viết giấy để gửi xuống. Có thể tiếng Anh hoặc là tiếng Việt, thì câu hỏi đó sẽ được dịch lại cho giáo sư. So now it's time for the Q&A session. Em mừng. Okay. Okay, so Dr. Ha will have one question for Ressa.
So my first question, I have asked you about. So at first, I want to choose a journal to submit. So, in your experience, which journal I can choose to submit my article?
So the question is, which journal do I choose? And I guess that's a very tough question. Very tough. Very good question. So, there are journals to avoid. I've already talked to you about that. I think one of the best ways remains to look at the literature you have cited in your own paper, in the introduction and discussion, to look where that work has been published. It's most likely the work you're doing is highly relevant to those journals, particularly if it's a group of journals in the same area. So in gastroenterology, for example, in my field, the best journals are Gastroenterology, Gut, the American Journal of Gastroenterology, Clinical Gastroenterology and Hepatology, Alimentary Pharmacology and Therapeutics, blah-de-blah-de-blah. There's a list of the top 40. I know that list. I look at that list. I look at the list of the top 40, and I look at the list of the journals I've cited, and then I decide how good is my paper. If it's really good, but it's a subspecialty paper, gastroenterology, number one, or gut, number one, number two. When they reject me, American Journal, Alimentary Pharmacology, I go down the list. If most of the citations are from Alimentary Pharmacology and Therapeutics, I may well go there first, because that's the area of greatest interest of the work I'm publishing. It's a pharmacology study or a pharmaceutical related study of some sort. So I go there. So it's a judgment call. If it's of general medical interest, broad interest, I might try the New England Journal or the Lancet or whatever. I have my top list of general medical journals. And, you know, you need to have the list. These are based on impact factor number. So gastroenterology impact factor 20. I like that. That's good. Gut 19. Not bad. You know, American Journal of Gastro 11. That's okay, you know, and go down and down and down. Yeah, and then there are journals at the bottom that are 1 or 2, but they're all good journals. They're all good. Yeah. So I have my list of favourites in my field and lists of what I've cited, and often they overlap. That's what I do. But it's hard. Sometimes you know, I'm publishing work in the microbiome. We have a whole research interest now in the microbiome. So I'm having to learn all the journals in the microbiome space. Oh my goodness. I mean, what do you choose? Microbiome, there's a journal called that. You know, Journal of Clinical Microbiology, which I published in before with the Helicobacter work. I mean, you know, Nature Microbiology, I like that journal. You know, where do I go? I just do what I've said. Top list, what I cite, this is where I think it's going to go. So, I haven't been very helpful, I know, but that's what I do. Of course.
I have one question for you. So we have talked about the authors, about the manuscript, but I have some concerns regarding the reviewers. So could you please explain to me, you know, what are the criteria for good reviewers? A good reviewer, because sometimes I doubt that my manuscript may be judged by some disqualified one.
So how do journal editors choose reviewers? So most journals have a database of people who have reviewed or might want to review for their journal. In my journals in the past and currently, if you've already done peer review well, because we give a grading to our peer reviewers out of 3. Top notch, mediocre, oh boy, not very good. Seriously. And if you get one of the low ones, or the lowest one, we don't use you again. So think about that. Or you can get, yeah, anyway. Or we don't usually. So we rank our reviewers. If they've done a good job, we'll use them again and ask them again. Reviewers are asked to list their areas of expertise. So we use that list. We look at the manuscript to see what articles you've cited. There may be reviewers in there we will use. I use a list called Expertscape. It's online. This lists the top leaders, thought leaders in the field across most disciplines. And I ask them, even if they've never peer reviewed for us before. I still rank them. You can be a top Expertscape expert and get a terrible ranking and never get asked again. You can. So that happens occasionally. So, you know, and you can look anybody, you can look me up in Expertscape. I'm listed. Yeah, you can look me up, you can look everybody up. So that's very helpful. So that's what we do. So it depends. Some journals, it's a bit more ad hoc, and so it really does depend. But you're quite right, the peer review matters. If you get 2 or 3 poor peer reviewers who say the paper's no good, but they're not very expert themselves, that's obviously a risk. And sometimes that happens. It does.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. And the next one, so is then a situation that the reviewers who had rejected the manuscript appears in the next journal. I mean, for the first journal, yes, the peer reviewer gives some bad comments about the manuscript, and the next one here again. So how should we recognize and how should we overcome this?
Look, human beings are difficult. Human beings are difficult. I've had the personal experience of submitting a paper, getting it peer reviewed by, I think I know who, and then subsequently 6 months later they publish a paper in the same journal with very similar results, and I think you can realise what happened, or what possibly happened. So you have to accept it's not always fair. It's not. All you can do is grow a thick skin, seriously, and try not to get too upset. I mean, it happens to all of us where we get a bad deal. Sometimes it goes the other way. Sometimes you'll get help from peer reviewers that means your paper gets published when perhaps it shouldn't have even, but it gets up to the standard with their help. So it works both ways, and you just have to accept the punches. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. I'm sorry, that's the way. And you can't remove people's bias. You just can't. It's just impossible. Some people, you just can't.
Okay, thank you. And about one statement I got from my college a long time ago, that have a lot of small papers is better than a big one, I mean IF. So what do you think about this?
Now we come to a tough problem. Look, I think the world's changed. I really do. I think the days of small papers getting into bigger journals is almost gone. I think you're more likely to be successful not salami splitting your study into multiple small studies, but in putting it in one good journal. Now, I recognise many universities look at the number of papers and can't judge the quality. I realise that. But I also recognise that if you publish a good paper in a good journal, which gets cited and recognised, that is a very good trajectory to be on, because it's likely your next couple of papers will similarly be successful over time, and you start to get a reputation and a name. Small journals, small papers, unlikely to be read, unlikely to be cited, unlikely to be recognised. I don't think that's the essence of good science, and I think we should always try to be good at whatever we're doing. So my view remains, in the current world, it's more important to publish good research than to look at the number of papers. And I think the number of papers is going to become less important over time, not more important.
Có ai đặt câu hỏi không ạ? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. English language editing is one of the big problem for some author in Vietnam. I know that some publisher, they offer many services relating to language editing. So can you suggest some good services from some publishers for the Vietnamese author?
To be honest, I don't have a list of English language services I can recommend. I just don't. I think you're quite right. The English language is an important piece of this. I think the solutions vary locally with all sorts of different approaches. I mean, one approach is to have someone with English language skills review your paper and try to help you improve the English expression in-house, if that's possible. Some journals offer services, but the trouble is if you don't submit a paper they can understand, it doesn't get a chance to go through that process. So it's a catch-22, you get stuck. I don't know what's available locally for English language, but I'm sure there are services that are available. And I guess that the hard reality is anything you can do to improve your scientific English for example, time overseas is incredibly valuable if it's at all possible.
I have a question. With some famous medical journal such as New England Journal of Medicine or JAMA or GMA, I would like to know, according to you, what journal should we apply a paper in order to accept easier? Thank you.
You ask a great question, and there's no great answer. And I think it's fair to say journals like the New England Journal will publish work from places like Vietnam for sure. They are interested in some of the diseases that are common here, that are important here, that are relevant not just here but elsewhere. They're very interested. So it's a little bit about what's the research about, and then how higher quality is the work that's been done. It's a combination of the two. And you know, you certainly see, I mean, for example, the Ebola outbreak in Africa, the Ebola virus outbreak in Africa. That got published in the New England Journal. There you go. Local outbreak, nowhere else, at least so far, well, I don't think so, published in the New England. Why? Because it's an important disease, an important outbreak, something people need to know about. That's helpful. How do you get there? My practical advice, find a collaborator. If you want to get into a US journal, find a US collaborator. If you want to, you know, seriously, because they tend to be a little, I'm being broadcast now, there tends to be some bias that you know, in that direction. I'm being very practical now. And I think in that Ebola example, they had some US CDC investigators working with local investigators. You know, so there are lots of opportunities. And then the quality of the research has to be good too. So if you're studying a disease, it's got to be, you know, it's got to be well done to get into a journal like New England Journal or the equivalent. But I think there's many examples. One of the great strengths you have, large numbers. Large numbers. They really help. Much more convincing when there's thousands and thousands than if there's 10 people. Seriously, large numbers. But then you have to have the infrastructure of databasing and collecting information in a systematic way so you can use the large numbers to your advantage. So setting up the research becomes relevant. But the New England Journal is well within reach of any researcher in this part of the world, but you need to have those approaches if that's where you want to go. And I'm sure there are people in Vietnam who have published in all those major journals.
Thank you, Professor. I have some comments. Actually, you are very right and practical about the collaboration. You know, because our university has one publication in New England Journal of Medicine in fertility, I mean obstetrics, and they have very good collaboration from America. So it's very good advice for us. Có ai có câu hỏi nào nữa không ha?
Professor Talley, I have a question for you. That if I have published my original paper on a local journal, would it be possible and ethical to publish it, to send it to another, I mean like a more superior international journal?
I mean, unfortunately, the short answer is no. Once you publish in a journal, even if it's a local journal in a local language, whatever, and this applies anywhere in the world, it is published. You can, there are other mechanisms to get the work out there, writing review articles where you cite your own work, etc. But you can't republish it even though it's in a local language. The classical is many of the Chinese journals, there are articles published that then people resubmit them, but if that's found out, that it's unethical, and that is a real problem. So unfortunately, once it's published, and if it's online, or it's available, you've got a DOI number. If it's got a DOI number, it's published. No, you can't republish it.
Okay, so I have some very practical questions for you. So the first one, in the ranking list of clinical studies, so I cannot see cross-sectional studies. So where are they? And they are very common in Vietnam. I'm not sure if they are good enough to be accepted in a good journal, or do you have any idea to make it more attractive to get acceptance? Thank you.
Can you define cross-sectional? What do you mean exactly?
I mean just a cross-sectional descriptive study at one moment, one time, just describes no control, just describe the situations.
Yeah. My advice, get a control group. Do a case control study. Seriously. A descriptive cross-sectional study is hypothesis generating only, largely. In other words, you can create new ideas from this, but it doesn't give you many answers. Following up the prognosis of a disease, that's a little bit different. Prognostic studies, a little bit, so you follow a cohort up, some of whom get worse, some get better. That's different. But that's prospective data, not cross-sectional. But cross-sectional, where it's just looking at the disease itself, you're right, it's descriptive. That's the whole point. Basically, it's a case series. So even if there's 10,000 people, it's 10,000 cases. But once you add a control group, you've got science. Sorry, I'm being a bit harsh, but I really think. And it's not hard to get a control group. You can get a control group from the same hospital clinic with something else or whatever. So I really would urge you to think about more than just cross-sectional, if possible. There are exceptions to every rule, by the way. So there are exceptions. Rare disease, nothing else. I mean, that's different. Rare disease, we've done cross-sectional studies of rare disease. But that is really the exception.
Thank you, Professor. And a very interesting question from Dr. Như. He's contributed a lot to the Vietnamese version. So it's very important because you mentioned of the abstract about the method, about the results, about the discussion. But how to make an attractive title for the paper?
Now you're asking that's a great question. Okay. So think about it. You want to be read and you want to be cited. If you write a title that nobody cares about, you will not be read and you'll not be cited. If you write a really interesting title or a title that is important, more likely. Most authors write terrible titles. Terrible. Absolutely terrible. I'm serious. Because they're not thinking about who's going to read the title. So I'm trying to think of some examples. That's a little bit harder. I think if you write something like, let me think about this. Hepatitis C and old treatments case series, nobody's going to read it. In fact, you probably shouldn't write that paper because it's not very interesting either. Okay? If you write new insights into therapeutic response to hepatitis C treatments, a case control study, that's much more interesting. That's actually, I might read that paper if I'm interested in hepatitis C or whatever. So think about it. So obviously your study has to match the title, but you need to make the title as interesting as possible to encourage people. Think about a book. Would you read a book with a really, really boring title? Would you read it? Would you even open it? Would you even look at it? No. Would you watch a movie that sounded the most boring thing you've ever heard of? Would you actually go and watch it? You know, The Avengers, the most boring version, that's the title. Would you watch that? No, I'm only joking, of course.
Okay, thank you very much. And the next one, at the very beginning, you mentioned of to present the study in one or two international conference. So you thought that this is not a good way because it's not a publication, but you think it's a good way of peer review. Okay.
So I hope I don't want to be misinterpreted here. I actually think it's really, really, really important to present your work at national and, if possible, international conferences, because it gives you a chance to stand up and show your work, to get peer review from people who are interested potentially, to get comments and critiques, to help you to improve the work and to improve the paper. So I think I encourage my trainees to always present at the national meeting and at the international meetings if possible. Always, always, always. But if you don't ever publish it in a journal, it doesn't exist. So in a sense, it's a waste not to publish it. But yes, I'd certainly encourage going to meetings. And when you go to me, I'm a bit old-fashioned. I want people to be critical. I want people to come by and say, I don't like this work. I don't believe you. I want that. Because that helps me get this right, get my work right. It helps me. I don't care what they say. But if there's no interest, that's really sad. So you hope people will come by, even if it's critical.
And maybe the next one. So about the systematic review, I have seen a lot of papers like that published, and especially Chinese authors. So many of them. But you said that in your institution, you encourage your candidate, your PhD students, or just a postgraduate student to do and to get them published by systematic reviews. So do you have a concise protocol or some instruction for us? Because we have the internal medicine department. There are a lot of young lecturers and resident doctors. So I think that they are very eager to do such research. Thank you.
It's a good question. So, the reason we encourage, and I encourage my trainees too, to write a systematic review and or meta-analysis, preferably a meta-analysis, preferably a quantification of the data, is I want my students to be world experts in the area of research they are doing. I expect my students, for example, studying a particular area, to have read every paper in that area, every paper. And they should know more than I do about that. Seriously, they should know more, not less, more. Certainly by the end of their PhD, they should be the content expert. They should know every paper in the field. And if they haven't done that, they've failed, in my view. Failed. No, they won't fail their PhD, but they failed in my judgment. Okay. And most of my trainees do this very well. They become the expert. And in fact, It's interesting. I've got one at the moment who's been working in gluten sensitivity and he's done wonderful work. Now he's the guy being asked to give all the talks everywhere. Not me. Not me. Him. That's a success. He's the world. It's fantastic. Yeah. And that's what I want people to do. So writing that systematic review is part of this. You have to read every paper. You have to read every paper critically. You have to analyse every paper. Guess what that means? You learn. You become the expert. That's what I want. That's very important. So this isn't a superficial exercise. It's important. There are good resources, like at the Cochrane collaboration, which will give you advice about how to do this. There are manuals at Cochrane you can download, which will tell you how to do this. If you need more help, let me know. I think, this is my bias, every trainee in clinical research, this is not basic science, this is clinical research, should learn statistics and clinical epidemiology as part of their training. I think medical students should do this too, because that teaches you some of the methods and some of the biases that you need to know. And so I did that when I trained. It was the best thing I ever did. Best thing I ever did.
Okay, thank you a lot, Professor. Có ai có câu hỏi nữa không ạ? Okay. Nếu như mà the last one is okay. Okay. Vậy là đưa cái câu hỏi trên kia, đưa cái micro lên trên kia. The last one, please.
No, I'm happy to have
Yeah, dear Professor, I have a question about I want to understand more about the way that the international journal can detect the plagiarism, and what happened if the author were detected they plagiarism. Yeah.
Very good question. So there are databases that there's software available that will search databases, not just PubMed but other databases, for identical wording. Now, every article has a small amount of identical wording. For example, the title of the journal articles doesn't change whether it's in this paper or another paper. So a small amount of plagiarism positive is fine. It's fine. It's completely within normal limits. It also, when it prints out for you or online, when you look at it, it actually highlights where the plagiarism is. So is it groups of text? So for example, one of the difficult areas is where your methods are identical because you've written 10 papers using the same study design because you've used the same methods. Actually, in a sense, it's almost impossible to not self-plagiarise in that setting. And that's acceptable, although it needs to be clear and, people try to minimise it, but it's not a big issue. Where it becomes a big issue is where half your paper is written by someone else. Not you, someone else in particular, because you've copied text. And that's obvious on the plagiarism checker. So what happens to people? Typically, if it's a moderate amount, but it's not a big deal, people will get asked to revise it and then resubmit, for example, or revise it and fix it. So that's easy. If it's very substantial plagiarism, the paper may well get rejected. There's not usually any punitive issues unless it's detected after the paper's published. Then it's a disaster for the authors, because the paper may well get removed, may well get taken out. Yeah. So don't let that happen. You can do it yourself. You can buy the plagiarism software and run your own. Many universities do it for their university student assignments. My university does it routinely. So school, it happens in school in Australia too. The kids get checked too. So, wow, world's changed.
Okay, thank you, sir. So Bây giờ là đến giờ để kết thúc. Nãy giờ chắc là mọi người cũng đã tận hưởng cái thời gian mà giáo sư chia sẻ kiến thức, những cái thông tin rất là bổ ích về việc đăng báo quốc tế. Thì chắc chắn là sẽ có nhiều câu hỏi khác, hoặc là ngại, hoặc là chưa dám đưa lên. Thì các bạn cứ gửi lại cho ban thư ký, và sau đó những câu hỏi đó sẽ được gửi về cho giáo sư để mà có được những cái lời khuyên sau đó gửi cho các bạn. So thank you, sir. So this is the end of the conference. But the last thing for Professor Hoa, she would like to know your feeling, your thinking, your impression about the lecture, about the audiences. So please, thank you for the last.
Well, I'd like to thank this audience for, first of all, sitting through 3 hours of me talking, and secondly, for the excellent interaction, excellent questions. This is one of the best audiences I've ever spoken to. So congratulations and thank you very much.
Là chương trình mình kết thúc. Xin cảm ơn quý vị đồng nghiệp. Dạ.